Rain beat the stained glass. He passed me a note, and after reading it, I ran away from the building and never came back. This is my most dangerous and weirdest story as a nun. If you value quiet, disciplined investigations from the inside, consider subscribing. I had served as a Benedictine sister for 14 years, most of them in the parish that sat a block from the harbor, where gulls tore at bait buckets and the foghorn measured out the evenings. My work was unglamorous and precise, setting linens, recording sacristy inventories, coordinating lay spiritual care appointments that were deliberately distinct from sacramental confession. Priests tended the confessional. I tended the people who needed listening, referrals, and structure. My days were measured by bells, by checklists clipped to a corkboard, by the comfort of sameness. This steadiness made small deviations loud. The visitor fit the category that demanded steadiness. He came on a fixed weekday, mid-afternoon, after the fisherman's market calmed. He signed the parish office log with a near illegible loop of a first initial and left slips of paper he called amends. The slips were simple declarations, by design, to help him stabilize what he had done, what he planned to do differently, whom he had harmed. I filed them, invited him to connect with licensed counselors, and documented dates and times the way our diocesan guidelines required. He smelled faintly of damp rope and motor oil. The first anomaly was olfactory, a metallic ribbon of singed frankincense that clung to his paper, though the parish had not burned incense that day. Frankincense saturates a sacristan's life. I could tell when a thurible had been overfilled, when charcoal had been lit too early. That afternoon the coals had stayed in their tin. The thurible's chain lay cold on its hook. Yet his slip carried that dry, almost blood-like resin note. I set it aside, marked the time in my notebook, and told myself that parish air travels in strange ways and that clothes carry old smoke. The second anomaly resisted such charity. His amends recorded a late-night errand to return a borrowed item to a local address, a step toward restitution. The parish policy required that I log any self-reported contact with vulnerable households. I wrote the address, then checked our door access export the next morning because he claimed he had prayed in the chapel afterward. The magnetized chapel door recorded no late-night entry, and the nave camera's motion timeline showed an empty aisle from just after Compline to just before Lauds. Around the same span, our incense count was off by 1 brick, even though no liturgy would have used it. I took photos of the inventory sheet, the shelf, and the empty slot. There were rational explanations. Memory plays tricks. People touch things and forget to mark them down. Separate volunteers may have moved the incense. I wrote a test plan as a line of plain sentences in the margin of my log: replicate the smell anomaly, shadow the inventory, cross-check external events. I set a standing reminder to verify the incense count at opening and at closing, and to photograph the shelf each time. I checked the door logs without talking about them, to avoid biasing colleagues. I considered asking the deacon for perspective, and decided to wait until my evidence moved beyond hunch. The next week, the visitor's slip included an apology for lying the previous week and, curiously, a time block that overlapped with a harbor siren report I had heard while folding purificators. The amends mentioned no sirens, only a peaceful walk. I opened the parish office window ledger and felt that same frankincense note drifting against the paper. It was not from the thurible. We had no liturgy scheduled for hours. I lifted the slip with gloved fingers and photographed the faint ash crescents along its edge, too pale for charcoal dust, too regular for accident. Evidence fragments began to pile up in my neat script. A sample entry read as follows in essence: late afternoon appointment, initial only. Slip smelled of resin. Ash along right margin. claimed to have prayed in chapel. Magnetized door shows no such entry between evening bell and morning bell. Camera event summary confirms stillness. Incense shelf -1 from morning count. Donation box contains envelope with matching left slanted loop on the letter G. I did not know what bound these facts, only that the links were getting stronger. The counter-hypotheses kept me disciplined. The smell could have been transferred from a jacket worn to another church. The ash could have fallen from a votive someone had extinguished. The loop-like letter G was a common hand quirk. The harbor sirens could have distorted my sense of time. I tested what I could. I asked the maintenance lead, in the neutral tone of a checklist, whether anyone had burned incense for a private devotion. He shook his head and mentioned that the carbon monoxide detector in the sacristy had chirped once in the night and then gone quiet. I logged it and photographed the device face for the timestamp. Patterns started forming where I did not want them. The visitors' slips began using specific phrases that I recognized from a category of groups that seek out the edges of religious language. Words like offering and gate and tide arranged in sentences that bent normal meaning. On evenings when such phrases appeared, chalk triangles showed up on the curb by the parish loading dock, faint and quickly rinsed by morning rain. The parish Wi-Fi, monitored by our cautious IT volunteer, showed a handheld device near the chapel, broadcasting a hidden network name that briefly renamed itself with an obscure saint's feast before vanishing. I did not have the technical reach to prove a link, but the timing lined up with the visitor's presence. A single envelope tightened the web. It was left in the donation box on a night when, again, we had not burned incense, and yet the envelope smelled like resin left too long on a coal. Inside, instead of cash or a check, there lay a glossy rectangle cut from a flyer, its edges inked with the same left-tilting hand. The image was of a hand-drawn reliquary, crude and triangular, and in the margin, a letter sequence that looked devotional at a glance until I noticed the initial letters spelled a harbor street we kept off public maps for safety during storms. The envelope's postmark space had been filled with a symbol pressed hard by a pen rather than stamped. I photographed it and sealed it with a note to myself to escalate soon. Ethically, I had reached a threshold I had rehearsed only in theory. Spiritual care notes were confidential but not inviolable when credible harm loomed. I reviewed diocesan guidelines in the quiet of the library. Language urging prudence, collaboration with licensed professionals, and immediate action when risk to others was concrete. The visitors' slips described no explicit crimes, only evasive words and timelines that contradicted logs. My mind toggled between caution and fear. In parallel, my rooms filled with that impossible scent. I smelled it while closing the office window, while rolling corporals, while locking the sacristy. Each time I checked the thurible, and each time the chain was cold. I needed an external data point, something beyond the parish bubble. The Harbor Authority's public radio log listed minor incidents, a flares call, a weather advisory. On the night of the overlapping sirens, a note recorded a suspicious van idling near the north lot beyond our property. The van had left without citation. Our lot camera showed only the flicker of passing headlights reflecting off stained glass, nothing else. The incense shelf that night lost another brick, despite no scheduled liturgy for another day. My photographs of the shelf, taken at opening and closing, lay side by side and told a simple story that felt like a trick of the eyes. Morning, full. Night, short by 1. Morning, full again the next day without any purchase recorded. I asked myself repeatedly whether I was building castles out of dust. People miscount. Volunteers borrow. Smells linger. Yet the visitors' slips began to sync with maritime tides in a way that was hard to ignore. times written in rounded words mapped onto the ebb listed on the harbor's chalkboard. The amends described leaving offerings near a triangle of stone. Our loading dock curb triangles reappeared in fresh chalk after every rain. The Wi-Fi beacon returned with a saint's name whose feast aligned with the visitor's schedule. The pattern was either a coincidence tangled by my anxious mind or a signal system using pious language as camouflage. The final hour of this first phase crystallized the dilemma. I found, wedged under the sacristy door, a folded paper cut to the shape of a triangle. Inside, a neat block of writing in that same left-tilting hand summarized a future act as if it were already done, using past tense for something not yet occurred. The paper carried the frankincense scent so strongly that my eyes watered. I photographed it, slipped it into a plastic sleeve, and sat with the diocesan guidelines open to the page that permitted breaching confidentiality when credible threat rose above rumor. I thought of the parish volunteers who closed the building at night. I thought of the visitor's looped initial. I ended the day the way I always did, candles checked, doors pulled twice, ledger signed. On the last line I wrote a question rather than a statement, a private rule broken in the margin where no one else would read it. It asked, in the simplest words I could choose, whether the language of mercy had been inverted into a code, and if so, how to act without becoming the thing I feared. The smell of frankincense lingered in the fiber of the page. I began with the parts that could be measured. The incense shelf had become a contested border, so I made it plain and boring. At opening, I counted aloud to myself, pressed each brick lightly to feel for crumbling, and photographed the row. I slid a thin paper strip behind the last brick, the kind of slip our altar guild used for notes, and penciled a tiny cross on its edge so I could tell if it shifted. I wiped the shelf to clear the faint dust that collects on every parish surface and left a line with my fingertip as a crude witness mark. At closing, I repeated the sequence. The paper remained flush, the fingertip line unbroken, the photograph identical to the morning. The next day, the count was short by one again, the paper slightly buckled as if heat had passed close to it, and the finger line smudged upward in a way my hand did not smudge when I mimicked the movement. The thurible hung cold. The smell of singed frankincense lived in the wood grain. I expanded the perimeter. The chapel door's magnet log remained my anchor, so I exported a longer run of entries and copied times into my notebook with slow care, translating their terse stamps into the plain language of the day. Door closed, door opened, door held. I matched those notations to the nave camera's periods of stillness and motion, which the system summarized as gray and bright bars. On evenings when the visitor left an amends slip with those bent phrases, the bars stayed gray through the night. Nothing moved in the camera's field. The door stayed shut and recorded no entry. Yet the incense shelf told a different story by dawn, and the donation box gave up envelopes with the left tilting loops on the letter G. I took my bias seriously. It would be easy to select the facts that frightened me and ignore the simple ones. So, I took what I called a humility day. I asked the deacon, under the pretense of reviewing ordinary risk procedures, to walk the building with me and look for drafts, vents, or odd circulation that might carry smells into odd places. He traced airflow with the back of his hand, pointed out a gap near an old window, and suggested a change in how we stored the charcoal tin. He mentioned the carbon monoxide chirp again and said maintenance would swap the batteries. He did not see the triangles in chalk on the loading dock curb. The rain had erased them. He did not smell the resin note I smelled, but his sinuses had long been numb to church odors. I wrote down his observations and adjusted the charcoal storage as he advised. The next evening, with no charcoal in the sacristy, The smell seeped back into the office where I filed the visitor's slip. It clung to the manila folder like a signature. If the odor traveled with the visitor, I needed to know whether it came from places beyond the parish. I delivered donated clothing to a shelter several blocks away because I knew he sometimes volunteered there. The shelter had the mixed smells of human need: soap, stale coffee, the mineral scent of rain-wet coats. No frankincense. On a later afternoon, I stood as a customer in a small religious goods shop across town where he had once purchased candles. The proprietor showed me beeswax pillars. I smelled faint honey and cotton wick. No resin, no metallic edge. I returned to parish work with a sense that the scent threaded only through our shared spaces, as if it were a note in a hymn only audible when he crossed our thresholds. The writing pulled me forward. The amends slips looked simple on the surface, but certain capital letters rose out of nowhere and did not follow the grammar he used. I copied them into the margin of my notebook and read them as an acrostic. The letters mapped to a short word that matched nothing obvious. The next week, the capitals yielded a different short word that, when paired with the first, resolved into a harbor landmark known to those who worked the docks. I held the two pairs apart in my mind, refusing to let coincidence harden into certainty. Then, on an evening that should have been uneventful, the chapel was booked for a private period of prayer by a family mourning a loss, and the pattern should have broken. The visitor's schedule placed him far from the building. The network logger our IT volunteer maintained showed the hidden beacon name for only a heartbeat, switching to a minor feast name and vanishing. The family's presence should have interfered with any ritualized timing. Yet the chalk triangle reappeared on the curb by dawn, its point aligned toward the harbor, and the incense shelf counted short by one again without any candle lit the night before. I photographed the chalk, then watched the rain take it away. Institutional pressure thickened quietly. The parish office hummed with the regular frictions of a small staff, and I felt the limits of being the steady one who preferred lists to instincts. A colleague, careful and kind, dropped a reminder on my desk about not taking on matters beyond my lane. The diocese risk office sent a general bulletin urging parishes to compartmentalize roles and to refer anything hinting at criminal behavior to civic authorities. The bulletin was not aimed at me, not directly. It landed on my desk like a small weight anyway. In the refectory, a sister mentioned that I seemed tired. I told her I was managing a stubborn set of mismatched logs. She nodded and reminded me that nothing good grows in secrecy, even when secrecy masquerades as prudence. I sharpened a pencil and wrote in my notebook that I would escalate when my facts stood straight enough to hold another person's skepticism. I tried to falsify my own cipher theory. If the capitals in the amends were a code, then they should fail when the visitor wrote naturally without intent to signal. I invited him, through the same neutral routine we used for every person, to write more concrete steps using verbs and names and to keep capitals ordinary. On those weeks, the capitals still formed harbor words. On one slip, the initial letters of each sentence stepped down into an acrostic that spelled a street that wrapped the back of the parish lot. I placed the slip under a lamp and studied pen pressure. There were hesitation marks where the capital letters appeared, as if the pen paused an extra beat to lift and set the nib. I compared these to a sign-up sheet for a retreat posted weeks earlier. A handful of names in the middle column bore the same pauses and the same stubborn leftward lean on the letter G. The names did not match any parishioner I knew. The handwriting sloped as if trying to disguise itself while still indulging old habits. The Wi-Fi data sounded fanciful when I tried to test it in plain daylight, but it remained the closest thing to an external signal. I asked the IT volunteer, outside the context of any person, to keep an eye on hidden SSID broadcasts near the chapel. He sent a simple summary the following week that I translated into the language of my notebook. Brief beacon, feast day alias, silent thereafter. The timing aligned with the visitor again. The beacon never reappeared at random, only in this narrow window, and only on days when his lips bent toward those words that felt more like liturgy misused than remorse. The next time it blipped into being, the donation box held an envelope with no money, just a scrap of glossy paper inked with triangles inside triangles. The smell of resin dizzied my head when I unfolded it. I ran what I called the reliquary test. The small glass-fronted case that held a minor relic had warmed on a night when candles sat cold, which I had chalked up to drafts and human hands. I dusted the case and left a fresh, thin film of talc on the wooden shelf beneath it to register movement. I pressed a hair along the seam of the glass to act as a subtle seal. I left the chapel closed for a full day with public access limited elsewhere on the grounds. When I returned after office hours, the hair lay askew. The talc bore a tiny cascade shape as if a corner had been lifted and reset, and the shelf smelled faintly of frankincense that had burned briefly and gone out. The magnetized door insisted no one had entered, and the camera bars remained gray and calm. My rational mind lined up the benign explanations. A draft through the old window might have carried a filament of hair. A caretaker might have checked the case and forgotten to note it. Talc shifts on its own. I wrote them down so I could not cheat later. The harbor offered my first external confirmation, if I permitted myself to call it that. A maintenance worker from the authority, known to the parish as a quiet helper with a penchant for sweeping sidewalks, told the office that someone had chalked triangles on bollards along the service lane 2 nights in a row. He had washed them away both times, and both times they had returned by morning. He used the offhand tone of a man tolerating an oddity. I asked to know the times only as a matter of tidiness, not law. He gave a small window that overlapped with the visitor's favored hour. The next morning, the donation box held a thin stack of flyers from an out-of-state retreat organization defunct for years. The top flyer bore an inked triangle overlay that matched the chalk proportions from our curb. The left-leaning loop on the letter G looked like the same hand that had haunted my files. Human pressure mattered as much as the logs. A volunteer who folded linens with me asked whether I had noticed a stranger sitting in the back pews during Vespers. She described the posture, the stillness, the way some people occupy space as if testing it. I nodded and said we would keep an eye on all visitors as we always did. I did not say that I had begun checking my own cell door twice at night, listening for hallway steps, breathing in quiet to see if the resin scent had crossed the cloister wall. It had. The first time, it came thin and barely there, like a memory. The second time, it lay on my veil where it hung on a hook, as if fingers had moved it. I washed the fabric and folded it, then wore another and told myself that fear rearranges air. The pivot hit on a night designed to break the pattern. The parish hosted a public forum in the hall, one of those loud gatherings that fill every corner with voices and movement. Doors opened and closed. Children ran. Between sessions, I visited the chapel to ensure candles were trimmed and the nave quiet. The visitor could not have staged anything in that bustle. I told myself that any coded sequence, if it existed, would need calm, darkness, and privacy. When we locked up, the building exhaled the way parish buildings do, a minor slump of silence after the crowd. Walking the perimeter, I saw no chalk. The next morning, the chalk triangle on the loading dock curb had returned, drawn so faintly the rain had not yet found it. The incense shelf counted short by one again, though the thurible remained untouched, the charcoal tin sealed. The key to the sacristy accounted, for the chapel door log showed no after-hours entries. The camera bars glowed gray and steady through the night. The reliquary hair lay straight as I had left it. My reliquary test had succeeded, yet the core pattern shrugged and continued. I could not keep the matter inside my notebook any longer. I compiled my artifacts into a straightforward packet: photos of the shelf, copies of the slips, summaries of door logs and camera summaries, the IT volunteer's brief notes about the hidden beacon, the maintenance worker's observation about bollard chalk, my own annotated translation of the capital letter acrostics. I left out nothing that contradicted me. Then I walked the packet to the pastor's office, breathed the steady incense that always clings to these rooms, and reported it as a risk to persons on parish grounds. He listened with the economy of a man used to hearings he cannot repeat. He reminded me of the line between sacramental secrecy and pastoral responsibility, and said the risk office would be consulted. He asked me to rest and to let the office manage next steps. I returned to my small tasks and tried to lay down the habit of tracking every shift of scent and line of chalk. Rest refused me. That evening, tucked beneath my office door, lay a shape cut like a triangle, the same narrow fold I had found under the sacristy door. Inside, in that slanted hand, an amends-like sentence performed a ritualized future as if it had already happened. And then, in smaller script below, a sentence acknowledging my packet by implication rather than by name. The paper smelled like resin, so intense that my eyes stung. The sentence named a time near dawn and a place near the harbor, and it used a word that I had tried not to think about in literal terms. I slid the triangle into a sleeve and sat still until the smell seemed to recede. I understood then that my careful distance had collapsed. The slips were no longer performances toward some other audience. They were addressed inward to me. I slept in my cell in the cloister with the door locked and the veil folded under my pillow like a talisman I did not believe in. Sometime near dawn, not long before the bell, the scent drifted through the room as if a coal had been carried past the threshold and snuffed. I rose, pressed my palm to the wood, and told myself a short list of rational possibilities. A draft from the hall, a sister moving with incense for an early service, my own mind releasing fear into the air. When the bell rang, I dressed and walked the corridor. The air was clean, ordinary, unremarkable. At the office, a small square of glossy paper sat where my hand usually rested to open the drawer. The triangle symbol had been drawn with care. The left tilting G loop was unmistakable. He knew that I knew, and now he knew where I stood and when I worked. Protocols exist to hold a person steady when fear begins to steer. I handed the packet to the risk office as the pastor had instructed. I offered the new triangle and the glossy square. I walked through the diocesan steps with composure I did not feel, recognizing that our world was about to open beyond parish confines to civil authority. While I waited for the call that would carry this out of my hands, I cleared the sacristy, collected the spare keys, and sat in the chapel with the thuribal's chain coiled in my lap like proof that it had not moved. The smell of frankincense rose anyway, thin at first, then pronounced, as if the resin burned in a place my eyes could not reach. On the pew beside me lay a folded paper scored into a triangle. I did not touch it. The door behind me clicked in a way the magnet lock sometimes clicks when the metal expands in damp. I stood, felt the church as a map of known doors and hidden passages, and understood that my clean distinctions between mercy and caution, between sacrament and report, had been arranged around me like a game board. I lifted the triangle with a gloved hand and slid it into a sleeve without reading it. I knew its contents in the same way a person knows a psalm by heart. The smell of frankincense attached itself to my sleeve as if to travel with me. The phone rang in the office beyond the nave, a sound that in any other season would have been a small thing. In that moment, it sounded like the hinge of the world. The call pulled the matter out of parish air and into procedure. The risk office logged my packet, acknowledged receipt in the formal way that leaves little room for relief, and coordinated with civil authority whose names remain outside this account. I was asked to maintain ordinary routines while avoiding direct contact that could inflame a situation I had already felt moving toward me. The instructions sounded simple and felt like walking a shoreline where the tide erased every step behind me. The culminating span began with a triangle folded from thin paper, placed not in a box or under a door but on the center of my desk, aligned so its point faced the harbor. Inside, the same left-tilted hand said a short sentence in past tense about a near-dawn act using that word that had been threaded through earlier slips. Below it, smaller script indicated a precise interval just before lauds and just after first light. The paper carried the frankincense scent at a strength I had only encountered near a thurible after a long vigil. I logged the time I found it, photographed it, sealed it in a sleeve, and wrote, in my notebook, a stepwise plan for the morning that read like the opening of any quiet day. Arrive early, verify charcoal tin sealed, count incense bricks, check the chapel door magnet log, glance at the nave camera bar summary, report anything anomalous immediately. At first light, I walked the perimeter. The loading dock curb was clean, rain having washed it in the night. The chapel door blinked its normal green when opened with the standard key. The magnet log recorded my entry in the terse code I had learned to translate. The nave camera presented its simple gray bar marked with time ticks. The incense shelf count matched the prior evening's closing, neither short nor disturbed. The thin paper marker flush with the rear board as I had left it days earlier. I locked the sacristy, placed the keys on the hook in the office where they always hung, and sat at the desk to note each step with the kind of plain language that holds panic at bay. The interval named in the triangle arrived. The Wi-Fi monitor on the small Parish laptop, configured by our careful volunteer, displayed its quiet list of known networks. For a breath, a hidden beacon announced itself with the name of a minor feast that corresponded to the day's date, then disappeared. I wrote the minute down in words. The nave camera's bar remained gray and still. The chapel door did not log an opening. My phone, held steady on the desk to serve as a clock and recorder of any movement in the office, marked the minute with the small, steady pulse I had learned to trust. The building was silent in the way buildings are when they are full of their own echoes. I stood, walked to the chapel, and smelled the resin before my hand found the knob. The thurible still hung from its hook. I lifted it with a gloved hand. The chain was cool. The bowl was clean and showed no residue. The charcoal tin was sealed as tightly as it had been the evening before. I unlocked it, counted the discs, closed it again. The incense shelf, a moment earlier correct, was now short by one brick. The thin paper marker I had wedged behind the last brick curled like a leaf that had felt heat and then cooled. I photographed it, forcing myself to hold the phone level so my later self could not accuse my current self of tilting the evidence to match my fear. On the floor below the shelf, the faintest crescent of dust traced a line from the shelf edge to nowhere. No shoe print disturbed it. The magnet log showed no entry between my first and second checks. The camera bar did not brighten. The reliquary's hair seal lay straight. I brought my observations to the office in a stack, the photos, the written time in words, the count. I prepared to call the risk office. Before I pressed the button, I saw another triangle paper, this one cut smaller than the first, resting on the lip of the donation slot. Inside, a single sentence written in that slanted hand named me by religious name and role in a frame that turned my duties into a scripted offering. It indicated the harbor service lane and the same near-dawn interval already passed, as if the moment we had just lived had been a rehearsal for a step that would move outward. It was a threat written as liturgy. I slid it into a sleeve, wrote its discovery time in words, and made the call. From that point, the day moved under other people's control. The parish adjusted access quietly. Doors were kept to daylight hours only. 2 staff were assigned to any closing task. My ordinary appointments were suspended. The office phone carried instructions and a code of courtesy that parish workers know by heart. I was asked to leave the building under a simple escort and to stay with a community member away from the grounds until further notice. I packed a small bag with the practicality of a woman who has moved between cells before. A veil, a breviary, clean linens, the notebook I could not leave behind. The smell of frankincense met me at the threshold of the office like a line I had to cross to step away. The immediate aftermath unfolded in layers. Within the parish, protocol shifted from good practice to rigid rule. The incense tin moved to a locked cabinet separate from the sacristy. The thurible chain was logged with the care usually reserved for vessels. Door logs were reviewed each week by someone outside the parish. The Wi-Fi monitor ran on a schedule and exported summaries off-site. Envelopes in the donation box were quarantined for inspection before counting. Spiritual care appointments moved to daytime only, in pairs, and within sightlines that protected both the person seeking help and the person offering it. These were changes of habit more than changes of theology, but they felt like drawing a circle around something that prefers to move in shadows. At the human level, the air thinned. Volunteers asked gentle questions that I answered with the measured vagueness that situations like this require. A sister left a note reminding me to eat. The pastor's face, when we passed in a hallway days later, carried the restrained sorrow of a shepherd who has seen too many burdens placed on a small flock. The risk office arranged for me to step away entirely for a season. In language that framed it as respite and restoration, they proposed a transfer to a house across the border where I could work quietly until the matter settled or changed shape. The route would be simple, the address unlisted, the expectations limited to prayer and ordinary tasks. I traveled with the sense of stepping sideways rather than forward. The fairy smell of diesel and salt replaced the harbor I knew. The house that received me sat in a town of weathered roofs and tall trees. Its chapel was plain and bright. In that first week, nothing smelled of frankincense unless the sacristan set the coal and the priest lifted the thurible. I performed small duties with deliberate slowness. I slept through the night for the first time in many days. My notebook sat closed on the small desk by the window. When I opened it, the last page from the parish was not the triangle or the time written in words, but the question I had copied from the margin weeks earlier about language and code, and how mercy can be turned inside out. Even at distance, ambiguity remained. The civil authorities' work was not mine to follow or record. I heard updates only in the broadest outline meant to assure me that procedures were underway. No one in my hearing used the word cult. They used words like group, pattern, concern. I understood that this caution protected more than liability. It protected the human tendency to fill gaps with fear. In that quiet, the counter-hypotheses returned like old friends I needed to visit again, that my mind had linked coincidences into chains, that multiple actors had touched the same places and produced illusions of connection, that a person with devotions unfamiliar to me had wounded no one, even if their customs frightened me. And yet the artifacts did not evaporate. The incense bricks had gone missing against clean counts. The hidden beacon had appeared at minutes that aligned with slips whose capital letters mapped to places. The chalk triangles had re-emerged on our curb after rain and on harbor bollards against the maintenance worker's hose. The envelope loops on the letter G had matched across contexts. The reliquary hair had lain straight one night and sideways another, while the magnet log claimed a seamless dark. The amends slips had shifted tone from contrition to performance, and finally to a sentence that named me in a role I did not consent to occupy. The ethical audit I had promised myself took shape in plain sentences. If the pattern signaled a group using religious forms to mask coordination, then my early hesitation could have endangered people, and the breach of confidentiality became a form of protection rather than betrayal. If the pattern was an artifact of my fear and fatigue, then I had wronged a person who sought help by seeing them as a cipher rather than as a human, and I owed an act of repair I did not yet know how to make. If the truth lay between those poles, then the lesson lived in procedure. That lonely rolls should never be left alone after dusk. That logs belong to more than one set of eyes. That sacred language is sturdy enough to survive being guarded with the same care we give to doors and keys. The motif resolved in a quiet act that I did not expect. Near the end of my season away, while helping in the small sacristy of the house that had taken me in, I opened a drawer of folded linens that had arrived from our parish as a gesture of shared work. The top cloth smelled faintly of frankincense, not as a fresh burn, but as a memory embedded in fiber. The scent rose and fell without pattern, and then drifted into nothing. I held the cloth, let the scent pass, and returned it to the drawer. It could have been residue from countless liturgies. It could have been nothing more than the way certain smells cling long after the act is done. It could have been another kind of signal meant only for me. I wrote the moment down and did not assign it weight beyond its size. I have returned to parish work with changes I insist upon even when they slow us. 2 people close a building, not one. Incense stock lives under dual custody. Spiritual care appointments occur in daylight near open doors. Logs travel off-site once a week. Patterns are reviewed by someone, not involved in the week's routines. The aim is not suspicion. The aim is to keep any one person from believing that duty demands solitary discernment. It is a quiet discipline that honors mercy by refusing to let it be weaponized. I end with the only question that still wakes me when a building settles and the night smells like old smoke. Who moved the missing incense brick and through which door if the magnet log never recorded an entry?